Hello everyone, so it is the 18th of February today and I have finished 2 of the 6 books for the Booktube prize. So I just thought I would recap and consolidate my feelings on the first 2 books that I've read. So the first book that I finished was I'm Glad My Mum Died by Jeanette McCurdy, and this is a memoir by Jeanette McCurdy about her experience from her childhood into adulthood. It's a reflection on her relationship with her mother and how that interlinks with how she got into acting as a child. And it is a dark story about a kind of codependency she had on her mother that her mum kind of fostered and cultivated through kind of a psychological, emotional, physical abuse. And this need Jeanette felt to please her mother. And then her mother's story is kind of that she always had a battle with cancer, which she exploited a lot to try and get Jeanette into roles. She used to keep telling agents and producers and things like that to try and get her into roles in films and TV. But the book kind of takes on a second arc when her mother does die, which obviously is not a spoiler because it's the name of the title of the book. And it's this kind of derailing of Jeanette's identity once her mother passes, and that level of control over her life has been taken away. She kind of free falls, and this involves alcohol abuse and bulimia. So when her mother was alive, she kind of cultivated this eating disorder within Jeanette, particularly anorexia and calorie counting. And when she dies, Jeanette kind of turns this anorexia into bulimia, and this drinking gets out of control, and she kind of falls into difficult relationships with people. The main relationship that she has with a man after her mother passes is very complicated because he has a lot of his own mental health needs, and she kind of forms another codependency relationship without realising it. And so it's a very stark look at her life experience and having to come to terms with what her mum put her through and the impact it had on her adult life. I think the last few chapters were really interesting about how she sought help to deal with her addiction and her eating disorder issues, and how her therapist had kind of slowly helped her acknowledge that a lot of this came from this difficult relationship with her mother. The first half of the book, I was kind of wondering where the story was going to go, because a lot of people said it's a scathing look at her relationship with her mother, and obviously the title is quite scathing, I'm Glad My Mum Died, and yet the first half of the book was filled with so much love and affection and obsession with her mother. But I think that's through the lens of her also being a child, that also being one of her main staple relationships in her youth, and how we all want to please our parents, and she didn't have the wherewithal and the understanding as a child to realise she was being manipulated. Her mother was emotionally abusing her into taking acting roles when, even from a child, she wasn't interested in acting. She was kind of forced into it as a way to please her mum. Her mum had a very erratic mood swings. Her mother would still, when she was 16, accompany her when she was having showers. She would do physical examinations of her. She would calorie control and go on diet plans with her. There was a lot of interesting layers that, with Jeanette's full kind of brave exposure of exactly what happened, we can realise those layers of abuse that as a child she didn't think were there. And I think it was quite painful to hear her kind of fall into these patterns as an adult once her mother had died, and kind of having to learn that her mother was responsible for a lot of this pain that she was trying to process as an adult. I thought it was interesting. She talked a bit about her time on iCarly, which is what she's most famous for, the child programme, and her relationship and friendship with the main lead. Miranda is her real name in the iCarly programme. And then her desire at the end to kind of pursue writing instead of acting. And you kind of wanted to go into the book and give Jeanette a hug and really realise that while you look at these child stars and you think they have a really great life and they're incredibly lucky, her story was filled with a lot of sadness. And she was put in positions that she shouldn't have been in, and her life was more sad than it was special. And I felt an immense sense of relief that she had left the acting world, that she was starting to come to terms with some of these really big life-changing structures that were put in her life that were really disruptive, like her relationship with food, her relationship with alcohol, her relationship with her mother, and she was starting to unpack those and trying to get to an overall place of healing, and to try and put away things like her purging, which was very difficult to read about. So I have utmost respect for her for writing this memoir. It was very, very readable, but it will be triggering to some people, for the alcohol abuse issues, for the eating disorder issues, and for anybody who's had a fraught relationship with a parental figure. I think it will be quite triggering. And it definitely wasn't a happy book, but at the end it was hopeful. And I think her writing is really good, and I hope that she does get a platform through this memoir to be able to write, because she is definitely a talented writer. And I wish her the best in the future. I think she's had a very damaged life, and I just hope that she can find some peace in the future. So I gave this 4 stars because it was so readable. I managed to read it in a day or two. I kind of couldn't put it down. And then the next one I read was The Facemaker by Lindsay Fitzharris. And this I literally just finished yesterday. I can't stop thinking about. I think it's just such an interesting story. It was such an interesting book. It's kind of floated a lot of ideas around in my head. I think it was a book that deserved to be written, that we do need to consider and look at in more detail. And I think the way this book was handled was really well done. The author, Lindsay Fitzharris, has mentioned kind of at the end of the book that she wasn't sure whether it was her place to write this narrative about these people, how to make sure that it was sensitive to the patients that she mentioned, and it was overall a story of the patient's experience and the history of the practice, rather than just a glowing review of certain practitioners. And I think she really did this justice. She did an immense amount of research, and it didn't feel like it was just a biography of a physician, or that it was just a dense history of something. It came together as a really well-formed story. So this story is essentially about the physicians, the doctors, the dentists, the artists, the nurses who helped create and kind of expand and evolve the practice of plastic surgery during the First World War. So the main character, the main figure that Fitzgerald mentions a few times throughout the book is a gentleman called Harold Gillies. I don't know how you say that. And she does mention a few other practitioners, be they dentists that he worked with, other surgeons who were also doing innovative work in plastic surgery in different countries, like France and Germany. And he mentions nurses that help him at his famous hospital, the main hospital they talk about throughout the book, which is called Sidcup, and it's kind of focused around the hospital and the patients and the evolution of plastic surgery. So it mentions how previously to World War One, some procedures had already been done, going quite far back, but they hadn't been standardised. Procedures hadn't evolved, and it talks about how Gillies and other practitioners then start investigating things like rhinoplasty, skin grafts. It also talks a lot about other side kind of medical advancements throughout this time, like blood transfusions and other things that really helped medical professionals preserve life during World War One. So it's really interesting, Gillies' story. He kind of started in ENT, and was helping with kind of throat larynx, I forgot the word, but larynx conditions. His boss, he started at a practice with another practitioner who his job was kind of to help opera singers with their vocal cords and things like that. And then the World War happens and he signs up his services, and he quickly realises over the progression of the First World War that facial disfigurement is becoming something that's incredibly prominent, as well as people losing limbs. A lot of people were having just facial deformities, disfigurements. People were having their jaws completely taken out. They were having bullets, enter and exit part of the face, the cheek, the ears, the eyes, and particularly the nose. These were areas that the doctors just hadn't had to deal with on that scale. And over the progress of World War One, Gillies met with loads of different practitioners. He realised there wasn't really a place set up to deal with this, and a lot of doctors didn't know how to cope with this. And he kind of had a unique set of skills working in the ENT world to try and tackle it, and he was a surgeon. So he kind of creates Sidcup as a place that all these disfigured people can eventually access, or hopefully access, and turn up, and he would create a place to deal with this particular issue. What I found really fascinating wasn't just the innovative surgeries he was doing and that others were doing, and the advancement in this field that he managed to work on over the years, but that Sidcup was very unique and innovative in the sense that it was a place purely for people with facial disfigurements. So that kind of embarrassment and that shame of having a facial disfigurement was kind of minimised because they could see themselves in other patients. And also that Sidcup had a very holistic approach to therapeutic treatment. So they were all able to walk outside the grounds together with nurses. They were all encouraged to participate in physical activity. They were all allowed to decorate for holidays and were allowed other pursuits. So it really helped minimise the kind of depression they felt, because a lot of these people that had facial disfigurements had to have multiple, if not, 10, 20, 30 procedures to fully correct some of their issues. It's a long time to kind of wait for procedures and have minimal change and to stay upbeat. And he also focused a lot on having resting, convalescing units so that he could kind of do an op. Then when they had to wait for it to heal, they could go in there and he could free up space for more operations. So it was very ahead of its time. And I loved how after the war, Gillies carried on doing surgeries for disfigured soldiers, and that he also really pushed to try and legitimise plastic surgery, which he ended up being able to successfully do, to create organisations and boards of plastic surgery, which hadn't really been established before. So I thought the narrative was just really interesting, and I loved that there was that focus on patients, and that it really was interesting for me, this kind of facial disfigurement affecting the psyche of an individual. How it mentioned quite a lot through resources that she'd accessed of diary entries and other people's entries, in newspaper articles and things like that, how facial disfigurement makes a stranger of the person. So they lose a sense of identity because they become unrecognisable to themselves in a mirror. How loved ones disassociate from them. There was a few patients in this book where loved ones had been horrified to see them. People they were engaged to had broken off engagements. They didn't want to marry them because of their facial disfigurement. There was one gentleman whose story was really interesting. He'd gone to another hospital in error that had dealt with kind of amputees and other kind of injuries, and he felt like the freak there. He was really withdrawn, and there was a lot more of an abrupt, harsh treatment. Nurses weren't quite as affectionate and caring with their patients. They were more brisk, and when he transfers to Sidcup, he realises that not only is he treated more like a human being, but he doesn't have to feel embarrassment about his particular ailment because everybody else there had it. And there was a jovial spirit between them all. They would joke, they would laugh, they would play games together, and he was happy that he kind of found the place that he needed to be, because the outside world really didn't want anything to do with him because of his facial disformity. How a lot of people who were going through operations to repair facial disfigurement issues, they were mentioning that they didn't want to go back out to the real world. They wanted to carry on having procedures or to stay in Sidcup because they were terrified about how the world they'd come from would receive them. They felt like they weren't given a hero's welcome back in their communities, like amputees were, because they were horrific to look at. So all of that exploration in this book was just so fascinating to me. And this I've decided to give 4.5 stars because I think this is something that is so fascinating as a topic that everybody could learn about. I think some people might think that they know a little bit about this topic, but this will really enlighten a lot of people. This was so compulsively readable. Lindsay Fitzharris made a perfect book that was informative and that was kind of at the patient-centred, at the heart of their experiences, that wasn't just a dry history of this topic, that was just so readable and that just made you really think. I just found it an incredibly important and poignant book, and it really deserves to be in print because it's a piece of history that is so important. It's documenting the kind of birth of plastic surgery as we know it. It's really recognising the practitioners who put their life on the line and really push themselves to help the wounded soldiers have some kind of quality of life. It's a really hopeful and interesting part of history, and it was just so beautifully written and highly readable. I think as soon as I can I'm going to get a copy for my mother to read because I think she would absolutely love it. She was a history teacher, she's now retired, but she loved anything World War I and World War II, but this is such a unique part of World War I's history that I think she will just fly through this and she'll find it really interesting. So those are the two that I've read so far. So at the moment, I keep calling it Facemakers, The Facemaker is number 1, and I'm Glad My Mum Died is number 2. I'm about 10% into the Fintan O'Toole Irish history one. I'm finding that slightly more dry than these other two that I have read, so we will see how I get on with that one. It is a chunker as well, but I've got it on Kindle. The other two books that I've just mentioned, I read them as ebooks. I read one on Kindle and one on the BorrowBox library app, so I don't have them physically to hand. But I also have 2 more books that I have taken out the library which I need to start, which are, I have The Sentient by Jackie Higgins, so I need to give this a read. I think, rough prediction at the moment, I think that if this is written well, this might end up in the top 3 with the 2 that I've just read, because I think it will be very hard for the rest of the 4 other books in this selection to bump the other 2 off the list, particularly The Facemaker, because I loved it so much. But I think if this one's done well, this might end up in the top 3. And I also have Dennis Duncan's Index History of the... I don't know whether this is going to be quite dry. It might be quite English languagey, so I'm a little bit apprehensive to read this one. And then I also have on reserve at the library, I think I'm second in the line for it. That is The Magnificent Rebels, The First Romantics by Andrea Wolfe. Yeah, I'm second in the queue for that, so I should be able to access that in March. So that is where I'm up to with my reading at the moment. I will check in with you guys when I've read some more books so that I can do some more wrapping up and ranking for you. So I'll see you then. Bye for now. Hello everyone, so this is just a quick update. I have finished the next 2 books on the prize list. So I'm just going to talk about them very, very quickly because I don't actually have that much to say on these next 2 books. Suffice to say, they weren't my favourite of the 4 that I've currently read out of the 6 that I have to read. So we'll start with We Don't Know Ourselves by Fintan O'Toole. I've decided to give this a 2.5/3 out of 5 stars. I don't want to be overly cruel against the author because I think the author can write really well. I just kind of got the sense from the first couple of chapters that this wasn't going to be my kind of book. It's a very sweeping history of Ireland all the way from kind of the 1950s to 2018, so pretty much as near to present day as you can get. And it was spanning loads of different topic areas, but I found that the chapters didn't stay condensed to a set topic area, so we were having 3 or 4 or 5 possible different musings or introductions to a topic. Then we would have some quotes from people about that topic, and then we would move to a similar topic but a different one, and we would kind of snowball chapters in that kind of way. And then interspersed were O'Toole's own experiences and anecdotes and stories of his childhood. But there were some big topics that were spliced in that made me feel kind of confused about what each chapter was attempting to deliver. So we would have things like the IRA, Catholicism, extreme conservatism in Ireland. We would have the birth of the television, we would have Ireland's relationship to America and pop culture. We had Ireland's bid to get in the EU, we had abortion, we had sex education and contraceptives. We just had like a whole, we had like the Catholic Church and this whole kind of child abuse, paedophilia as well. We had these massive topics, we had like banking as well, and just huge topics. And for my personal preference, I would have probably condensed the topics that he wanted to discuss and have delivered them in more detail, but in a more tightly condensed topic per chapter structure. That's my personal preference. I know a lot of people will have loved the way this was written and all the topics that were addressed. It's just a personal preference thing. I think I like very condensed and to the point chapters where they're almost like a condensed story each, and that are written in a narrative non-fiction style so that I can fly through the book. That's just my preference. So this is nothing against the author, this is nothing against the book. I just kind of knew very early on I wasn't gelling with it, and that just didn't change, so unfortunately my rating reflects that. And then the next one I read after that was Index, A History of by Dennis Duncan, and I have decided to give this 3 out of 5 stars. I think what clinched a kind of a half a star more for Mr. Duncan was he has a very good writing style. It's obviously self-evident that he's very well educated in English literature and language. He can write something, and for set paragraphs in the book. He had me hooked, he was telling me a narrative and I was fully invested. But the problem for me is that I think this would make a really interesting kind of half an hour, 40-minute specialist subject lecture, or a podcast, or a talk. But I knew I didn't have enough of an interest in the history of where indexes came from. You know, going back from the 1500s, we kind of discuss friars and all the way to how there's official organisations and there's official training to become a professional indexer in the modern day. I knew that my interest levels were going to wane for the entirety of a 200 to 300 page book on this topic. Personally, because it doesn't interest me enough. I think Dennis Duncan did a very good job of trying to interest me, and I think his writing is amazing, and I think he's probably an incredibly interesting person. I just think this was a case of just not my topic, and I think that's okay. I don't want to say any more because I think that kind of condenses how I feel about that book. So it's not to slag any of these books off. I just think in the last few years when I've judged non-fiction, the calibre has been so high and the topics have been things that I have found an interest in. I think these two are just an example of it's kind of caught up with me, and these topics just are not for me, and that's okay because they're incredibly niche, so it's fine. So the next book that I'm reading is Sentient by Jackie Higgins, and I've read the first 2 chapters and I am really excited because I'm really enjoying this. I think she writes in a charming way, and she's kind of ticking all the boxes of what the other 2 books lacked for me in terms of structure. I've read quite a few nature books throughout the years of judging the prize, and I tend to lose a bit of interest only because this isn't my passion subject. A lot of people on the prize as judges, this is their favourite kind of non-fiction, nature and animal non-fiction. I enjoy it, but it doesn't set my world on fire, so usually they have to kind of be quite creative to interest me for an entire book. In the past I've had some flops, but I've also had some really fantastic hits, and I think this might be a good hit in this genre of non-fiction because she is keeping that narrative non-fiction. We're sweeping through the story, and she's chosen some very eccentric animals that are not usually as obviously selected in animal books, and she's linking them to senses and human experience and how humans have learnt more about this particular animal, and from that animal we've learnt more about our own senses. The first chapter was on the peacock mantis shrimp, and I've been googling the animals, the pictures, and it just looks like a really eccentric animal, full of vibrant colours and the funny eyes, and the story of it it's really fast boxing punch, and its sense of all the colours and how its optical abilities was just really interesting for me, because I think what she's done is she's picked animals and stories that we don't actually hear as much about or know as much about in kind of general nature writing, and she's kind of keeping us up to date with the latest research as well with these animals and with what we're learning about their senses and how they process senses. So yeah, I'm finding it utterly charming and really interesting. I've just gone on to the spookfish, and usually kind of like fish, birds, insects are my least interesting, but I'm finding these stories really, really interesting, and we're going to go on to moles, owls, the vampire bat, the bloodhound, cheetah, things like that. So I'm really excited to carry on reading this, which I'm surprised about, but I did say in an earlier clip that I do think that this might get into the top 3 with the other 2 that I've read, and it's strongly looking that way at the moment. So the final book after that is Magnificent Rebels. I've still got it on hold at the library, and it's gone down to, I think, 2 that I'm in the queue waiting for. It is the end of Feb now, so hopefully I'll be able to access it in March. If I get to around the first 2 weeks in March and I haven't got it, I will download it on Kindle, just because I want to make sure I read it in enough time, and I do know that it's one of the chunkier books on the list. But I'll catch up with you guys in my next clip, hopefully when I finish the Sentient and can wrap up my rating and thoughts, and hopefully when I'm starting Magnificent Rebels. So I'll catch you in the next clip. Bye for now. Hello everyone, so this is my final clip, so I am just going to wrap up the last 2 books that I read and give you my final rankings for this round. I do apologise, I'm in my snoodie because it's Saturday morning and I have a lot of work to do with my university master's research project. I am about 2 weeks behind due to going away with family and other stuff, so that's why I've got my pen, because I've got documents laid out everywhere and my laptop on in the background, so I thought I would just film this now and get this out of the way, and then I can spend the rest of the morning doing a bit of work before I need to leave the house. So anyway, back to the books. So when I last spoke to you, I had started Sentient by Jackie Higgins. Both of these books now I have returned to the library, so I will insert a picture up here, but I no longer have Sentient to hand. So overall I think it was a good and interesting nature book. I gave it overall 3.5 stars. I think it was informative on the different animals. I like that she chose a vast array of animals and that she linked them quite well to the sentient sensation, whether it was sight, hearing, touch. I think in nature writing in general, these kind of approaches have been done before, in terms of I've seen in the past in the prize chapters dedicated to certain animals, but I think she did it in a refreshing and interesting way because she linked it to our human sensation, and she kind of created a narrative that had the animal and the human and the connection between quite clearly defined. I think the chapters were well structured and organised, and I think she had a knack for writing quite narrative non-fiction so that it felt a pleasurable experience to get through the book, whereas in the past some of the nature books I've been given to read, I felt an obligation to kind of trudge through it without having that level of enjoyment. So that's about all I can really say about that book, because it's not, now in hindsight, there's been a few weeks since I finished that one. I don't have much more really to say on it. And then the final book I read was Magnificent Rebels by Andrea Wolfe, and this was a huge surprise for me because I expected that Sentient would be in my top 3, just based on the subject matter of these different books. For example, Index, A History of, and this one I thought were going to be very heavy topics and they weren't going to be things that I was going to naturally gel with. In reality, I thoroughly enjoyed Magnificent Rebels, and I was quite surprised because this follows a kind of... It's set in the late 18th century, moving towards the beginning of the 19th century, in Jena, a little kind of town in Germany, and it follows a ragtag group of individuals who are academics, artists, playwrights, poets, scientists, and how they kind of create a bit of a group. So Andrea Wolfe kind of collectively calls them the Jena Set, and she tries to argue that, like other big established groups like Virginia Woolf Circle and the American writers like Thoreau and Walt Whitman and other people like that, that this was the very first kind of set of academics together, and they paved the way for these later groups. And she also argues that the Romantic period that we know in the UK, that sprung out from people like Wordsworth and Coleridge and a few others, and this idea of kind of a lot of deep emotions set in nature kind of brooding storms poetry and kind of the daffodil poetry that we know. And is it Tintern Abbey? Another really famous romantic poem. That all of that directly stemmed from this group and their work. And I felt like this read almost like a fiction because it was structured in a way that I found really compelling. It was about each individual person and what they worked on, but it also had this layer of really interesting dynamics between these characters, well, these real people, should I say, because they would fall out, there was affairs, people were jealous of each other's work, people were angry if their work got compared to somebody else, like Fichte, I don't know how to say his name. He created the ik philosophy, the I philosophy, that at the end of the book she kind of discussed how that philosophy is something that we just take for granted now, looking inwards to ourselves and being self-reflective, and how later on people like Freud adopted it for his psychoanalysis, and how we don't really ever think that we viewed the world as predestined because we automatically are aware of our own self-determination. But he came up with the concept. Then there was a lot of others that dealt with poetry and plays, and then they had Alexander Humboldt, who worked a lot on the sciences, and they showed that his work had a direct impact on people like Darwin. So I found it really fascinating hearing about their lives, hearing about a group of people I'd never heard of before, hearing that they are very similar to us in present day in terms of they wanted recognition, they were jealous, they kept having affairs and falling out, and it was all very interesting. And I liked how she took us through the creation of the group and then the kind of separation of the group and kind of where everybody ended up, because I often feel sometimes when you want to write something as ambitious as this, you tend to wrap it up quickly, and then as a reader you're always wondering, well, what happened to them, where did they go on from here? So I think it was very satisfying, and I would like to research more into these group of people and potentially see if I could in the future read any of the literature that they produced, obviously translated from the German into the English. But it was interesting as well, Caroline and Wilhelm were two characters in there that they had translated a lot of Shakespeare poetry into German, and I found it really interesting because she mentioned in the book how Shakespeare's almost more celebrated in Germany than he is here, and those were the direct translations that made that happen, and those translations are still used today in Germany. So it was just really interesting learning these little nuggets of information. So I ended up giving Magnificent Rebels 4 out of 5 stars because it was entirely a pleasurable read, and it was quite a chunky book, so I got through it in stages. But I was always surprised when I looked down at the book, because it was a hefty hardcover, how quickly I was getting through it, because the chapters didn't feel tedious, so I loved it. So my final rankings stand at, in first place is Facemakers, because I think Magnificent Rebels just couldn't really bump it off for me. I just kind of fell in love with how interesting that book was, and I've already told my mum that I'm pre-ordering it for her birthday, and she's very excited. Second, I'm putting Magnificent Rebels because it actually surprised me so much that I think it bumped the Jeanette McCurdy book slightly, because I expected to almost put it in the bottom of the pile, and for it to take me away and really connect to the narrative. I just think it was just slightly better than the Jeanette McCurdy, so although they were both 4 stars, I bumped it to second. Third is I'm Glad My Mum Died by Jeanette McCurdy. Fourth is Sentient by Jackie Higgins, which it was not a bad book at all, but I had a surprise, so it kind of pushed it out the top 3, but I think for a lot of people it will be in their top 3. It was a very well done book. Then 5th I have Index: A History Of. It just wasn't my personal cup of tea. It's a very niche subject matter, and for the right nerd they'll love it, but just wasn't for me. And then in 6th place I've put We Don't Know Ourselves by Fintan O'Toole. It could have connected really well with me. I could have been really interested. It just didn't land when I read it, so I felt that it was the least readable for me. Like, it was the hardest to get through, and that's why it's at number 6. So thank you guys so much for watching. I have put down my interest for the second round, so we shall see if I will get picked. If I do, obviously you'll be seeing another video, but thank you guys so much for watching this video, and I'll see you very soon with a brand new video. Bye now.